So talk to me about OpenHack. What did you guys think? Did you hate it? Did you love it? Did you learn anything? How are we feeling?
I definitely love it. I definitely met a couple people who had the same interests as I have. I even spoke to Mike, who hosted. He was telling me some pretty interesting things and stuff. Yeah, I mean, overall, I definitely enjoyed my time there for sure.
Nice. Anyone else? Thoughts on OpenHack? Good, bad, or ugly?
I had to stay home and study from day one of JavaScript. I've been at it for a couple days now. Even today.
Yeah, I was gonna say I unfortunately couldn't make it, but I've been hearing a lot of good things about it. And I definitely is I'm hoping there's another one soon.
Yeah, it's normally the second Tuesday of every month. So that date moves around a tiny bit some days. Some days they slide it to Thursdays, but I think for the most part, it's the second Tuesday of every month. And then I don't know if they mentioned if they have a Common Space Working Day, but that is a kind of a spin-off of OpenHack where they get together and hang out at Common Space for the day, and we'll go out to lunch together and try and just get the OpenHack community in person.
Oh yeah, Glenn was just telling me about I think it was co-working day this I
Yep,
think this Friday.
this Friday. Okay.
Yeah, it was definitely this Friday. I mean, I was gonna go anyway because, like I said, I go to Common Space like every Fridays and Saturdays. So,
Nice. All right. Any other comments on OpenHack? Hopefully encourages you to get out of your bubble a little bit, go talk to people. It is very important to network, and it can be very refreshing as well to see faces other than the faces that you see here every single day. To go talk about what you're learning, get practice at articulating certain terminology, certain vocab there. Talk about what you're learning, and then also see what the rest of the community is doing. So really great networking event. They just had their 10th anniversary. So that has been going on for a decade now, which is kind of crazy to think about. But we will definitely be at the next one on the second Tuesday of next month, and I will do my darndest to be there for that. Really did not realize my travel had conflicted with OpenHack, and I went, "Oh man, I'm gonna miss my first OpenHack with this cohort." But hopefully you guys got something out of it, or at the very least had some time to study up on JavaScript. And that brings me to my next point. We don't expect you to be able to use these concepts on day one. We don't expect you to use these concepts on week one, right? This week is all about getting you exposed to them. You don't have to fully understand them. You don't have to have the syntax memorized. This is your opportunity to kind of just let it soak in. And if you have questions about, well, why is it a parenthesis and not a square brace? Or why are we using a period there? Or my code isn't working. Those are all great questions to ask now. But tonight will be the first night that we actually rooted in some projects, right? So Monday's class was all kind of let's throw it at the wall and see what sticks, right? Let's just start playing around with it. Let's not necessarily get to that level of understanding, but it's an opportunity to say this is the first time I'm getting exposed to syntax, right? It would be like asking me to build asking you guys to build the Netflix website on day one of HTML. You'd be like, are you crazy? Right? But we work our way up to it. Unfortunately, JavaScript just comes in with a very high barrier to entry, right? And you look at it and you're like, I'm not connecting on terms, I'm not connecting on slides, I don't really know why we're typing this, but I'm typing it and it's working. That's an okay spot to be right now, right? That level of understanding is going to come over time. So the good news is we only have slides for one more concept, which is functions. And then at that point, we've basically exposed you to most of the fundamental principles of computer science. There are more things that we will learn about JavaScript that is unique to JavaScript, like the document object model, how we can make our JavaScript interact with a web page and our web page interact with the JavaScript. More concepts, obviously, to learn, but I don't want you to feel like, oh my God, day one, I don't get any of this. I need to go study my butt off. At the end of the second or third week of JavaScript, if you're feeling that way, that is a totally fine reaction to have, right? And in the daily outlines and in the textbook suggestion list, we definitely have resources for you there. Free Code Camp is great. Odin Project is great. And then as you guys find resources, feel free to share them in the CICC6 channel, because as they get shared, I add them to the list, and actually share like a couple sentence summary, right? Of like, hey, I found this guy on YouTube. I really like him because he teaches like Max does and it's all project based. Or you could post that same link and go, hey, I found this on YouTube. I really like this because it isn't covering the way Max teaches it. This person does an entirely separate way. They are more slide oriented, or they are more vocab centered, or whatever it is, right? So share those resources, because there's no way that we can teach you everything that you need to know in 12 hours a week for 24 weeks. So as you're supplementing the knowledge, whether it's from our list or from some resource that you found, feel free to share those. But at the same time, also keep in mind that we have 4 more weeks of JavaScript, I think, to go after this one. Nathan will be in next week, so you will get your first week break from me next week. Nathan will be coming in and teaching you all about DevOps. Nathan has worked for a couple local companies, and he's based, I want to say, somewhere out in the Midwest, but don't quote me on that now. But he has been teaching DevOps for the last couple cohorts. He's going to teach you about GitHub. He's going to teach you about deploying your first front-end website. So you'll use the portfolio site that we built in class for that. That is coming down the road. But you got 2 more days with me, tonight and tomorrow night, before you can fully shake me off. And so tonight, after we get through the function slides, we are going to shake it up a little bit, and we're going to start getting into project-based JavaScript, right? So why do we need to use these functions? How do we use them? Breaking down and using comments really for the first time beyond just opening of div and closing of div, and starting to get into that level of understanding, right? Hey, can I write a comment for this line of code? If I can't, I don't understand how that code is working, and I need to stop and ask a question. Or, oh, I can vaguely describe that in a way that if I came back to this code in 3 months, I would be able to read that and go, oh, that's right, I haven't used that concept in a while. But because I left myself some notes, I'm able to understand it. So tonight's class will be the first class that we not only see practical JavaScript, where we're posed with a challenge and need to write a script to solve it. We're also going to get more practice with data structures, objects, arrays, strings, numbers, all of that stuff we're going to get another touch base on. And then when we come back from the DevOps module, we'll do a much deeper dive into building out JavaScript that is actually interacting with our web pages. So week 6 is DevOps. We're in week 5 right now. And then week 7 will be all about layering in everything that we know about our HTML, CSS, with integrating it with our JavaScript. So we build some really cool projects like Tic-Tac-Toe. We get into some algorithm work. We will build a little movie seat application where you're able to pick certain seats based off of what theater you're in. So don't panic now. Don't panic in the end of the DevOps module. But the end of week 7 is where I would say, hey, now's the time I need to start reassessing and start going, all right, if this JavaScript stuff isn't sinking in based off of the way Max is teaching it, I need to supplement that, whether that's study groups that you guys get together on, whether that's a textbook that you can use your stipend dollars for, whether that's YouTube videos, whether that's the Odin Project or Free Code Camp. You guys are not alone in learning JavaScript. And I think that that's really important to acknowledge. And know that I am not the only teacher. I like to think I am a good teacher, but that does not mean that I am the only teacher or that you should only learn from me. So lean into your learning styles, because chances are you've never been in a boot camp environment like this before, right? It is going to feel fast all the way until week 24. And the number one thing that we hear from students after graduation is, what am I supposed to do now? Monday at 5:30 rolls around after graduation, and they're like, I feel like something is missing. So if you guys are feeling any stress, if you feel like you're not getting the concepts, feel free to bring that up either in stand-up really because that can benefit all the other fellow students, or schedule a one-on-one with me, right? And if there are no times available on the one-on-ones, shoot me a Slack message. Chances are I can work with you. I can do an early morning meeting. I can find some time in the weekend afternoons that are available. Those one-on-ones are really your opportunity to take advantage of having a senior developer who not only has experience teaching all of this stuff, but also learn the way you did, right? Of, I got a project, this is what I got to build. How do I learn JavaScript through those projects? And we'll get our first taste of that tonight. With all of that said, does anyone have questions? Okie doke. So we do have a couple more slides that we need to finish up on functions, and then we will dive into code. I can get the window positioned properly. Okay, so parameters, we touched on this briefly on Monday's class, but parameters are basically how we send data into a function, right? So a function is basically a block of code, a couple lines of, or could be a single line, but usually a couple lines of code that we want to be able to call over and over and over again without necessarily having to write those lines multiple times. So a parameter is basically how we send data into a function, and we've already seen that with console log. Console log can take one or as many parameters as you want, and it will print all of those out on the same line. So it is called a parameter when we define the function, and then it's called an argument when we send that data into that function. So here we're calling console.log. You can see that we've got two different parameters. And because they are in quotes, the console log is going, okay, this is just a string of characters. I don't really care what's in the string of characters. That's exactly what they want me to print out. Compared to this console log num1 down here, which is a little different. That console log num1, thank you, Tiffany, for posting that in chat. Sorry, I was didn't have my chat window open. This console log num1 is going to go, whoa, that's not in quotes. So because of that, that must be a variable, or that must be some command that I have to execute on. So it goes up, it finds num1, it finds that num1 is equal to 5, and then of course it will console log that out. Okay, well, console.log is a built-in function, and obviously we've seen the use of that, but oftentimes we will define our own function, our own couple lines of code that we want to be able to rerun based off of different kinds of inputs. So this is a function that adds two numbers together. So let's break this down a little bit. There are two types of functions. One that says function, just like we say const or let or for. These are all what we call keywords or reserved words that the computer knows, oh, I've got something built in under the hood to deal with that. In function type 1, we define the name of the function here. We see our two different parameters that get passed in. And then in between the curly braces, just like we do for our for loop, we tell it what's going to happen, right? And this is only a one-line function. It's only doing one thing. It's adding our two numbers together. But there is another type of function, and these are the preferred ones. So just like we have seen const and let, we know that those two are now preferred over var, right? Var was an older way of declaring variables. We now see that with what we call arrow functions. Arrow functions are defined a little differently. The syntax is a little different, but under the hood, they provide some additional benefits. And this is by far, because it's the newer way of declaring functions, the preferred way of doing it. So if you get into some older code and you see this type of function, it's not like you need to panic and go rewrite all of those. But whenever we make new types of functions, we are always going to use this style instead, just because it's a little newer. And like I said, for things that get into the weeds, it's a little bit better for the computer and more efficient. So anyway, here we say const Okay, well, we've seen const before. We declare what the variable name is equal to, right? So we're going to say this variable add is going to hold the function. And then we say, what function is that going to hold? Well, we define the two parameters here. We say num1 and num2. We need to send some data into it. Then we say equals and a greater than sign, right? And that is literally the equal key and an arrow. And that is why we call it an arrow function, because the equal and the greater than sign looks like an arrow, right? And then in between the curly braces, just like on the other function, we tell it what we want that function to do. And then what we do is we say we call or execute that function. So let's break that down a little bit. The first thing that happens here is the computer goes const add is some function. It's going to ignore that line of code entirely all the way to the closing curly brace, and it goes, I now know what you want me to do when you ask me to add, but I'm going to ignore that until you ask me to do it. So I'm going to console.log, and it goes console log. I know what that is. That's built in. We don't have to define a function for that. What would you like me to console log out? I want you to console log out add. So it goes and it goes, oh, I know that add is defined up here as some variable. Okay. Now it's going to take the 5 and 2 and store them in num1 and num2. So these are parameters here, because when we define the function, the input that we're sending into the function is called a parameter. But when we actually call or execute the function, when we ask the function to actually run, they are called arguments down here. So the arguments, basically, when we call the function, get sent into the parameters. Oftentimes, people will use those two terms interchangeably because they are very closely related. If you want to think about them as kind of the same thing, you can, but they are technically arguments when we call the function and parameters when we send that data in. Okay, so anyway, we take our 5 and our 2 and we send them into the num1 and num2 parameters. Now it goes, all right, now I've got the input for this function. What do we do with it? Well, 5 and 2 basically become the values of num1 and num2. And it goes, what do you want me to do? I want you to return, we'll get to that in a second, 5 and 2 added together. So it goes num1 and num2. I know what those parameters are. I know what those values are. It puts 5 and 2 in. It then adds 5 and 2 together to get 7. And then it's going to go, all right, what was calling this function? I'm going to return whatever was calling this function, the number 7. So it goes return to wherever add was called. Add was called down here. So it is now going to replace that number 7 in there. And finally, it will console log that out. Any questions on that?
So this is from
I had
memory.
one.
Oops. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Joe.
Just real quick, I put it in chat too. Are you able to specify a parameter type in the function, like when defining the function?
Not in JavaScript. There is a variant of JavaScript called TypeScript, and the reason it exists is pretty much solely that reason, is that all variables, including parameters, can have a type assigned to it. So there are two types of programming languages. There are statically typed languages like Java that basically say when you declare a variable, you have to tell me what data type that variable is. So you declare it as a string, and then if you go to store a number in that string, it's like, no, I only take strings. You told me this was a string, so I'm going to keep track of it that way. Then there are also dynamically typed languages like JavaScript that basically say, whenever you set the first value here, I will use that type of whatever you set in, and that will be the type of that variable. And down the road, if you now change your mind and store a string in it instead, it will dynamically change that variable type to a string instead. So the I don't want to say the elitist, but the purist programmer will say that statically typed programming languages are more beneficial because they catch errors earlier on in you writing your code. And so because of that, a lot of people have said, well, we would like to bring variable typing to JavaScript. And so they have with TypeScript. So basically, you write TypeScript, which includes more variable types. It doesn't introduce additional syntax, which is when you're learning JavaScript, layering on additional syntax on top of it can be a little tricky. So every cohort we go back to, are we going to teach TypeScript? Are we going to spend a day on it? Should we skip it? You know, we go back and forth. I personally don't find TypeScript to be worth it. Because it introduces complexity. You basically have to compile all of your code before you can execute it, unlike JavaScript, where you can just run it without having to do any compiling. So I personally haven't found the benefits of statically typed languages. And so because of that, I'm not a huge TypeScript fan, but that is certainly an opinionated topic, right? Some people really like statically typed languages. Some people don't think it's worth it. Like I said, I personally don't, but that doesn't mean that that is like the de facto answer. It is more of an opinion than a hard and fast rule.
Are there workarounds for like catching errors that result from I guess like you know, say the initial function where it's like num1 plus num2, and like you are tying those to like input fields, and the first one's like a number, and somebody puts like cat in the second one, and then
yeah,
like it would concatenate the string, but like how do you stop? Like how do you catch that?
Yeah, so you can do a try catch, or you can do an if statement that basically says type of, which is a keyword built into JavaScript we haven't touched on yet. If you say type of and the name of the variable, it will return back number or string or object. It won't technically return back array, which is stupid and complicated. But anyway, what you could do is you could say at the beginning of this function, if type of num1 does not equal number, throw error. If type of num2 does not equal number, throw back another error. So you can basically do manual type checking in JavaScript. But if you're building an application that would frequently be a problem, chances are getting into TypeScript would be more beneficial.
Okay.
Safi, I don't know that you can learn TypeScript in a day. You probably can learn it in 2 or 3 days. And so we will have to take a look at the schedule, because we are already a day or two ahead in HTML, and we are a day ahead in JavaScript as well. So that is an opportunity where we could bring, I think Ryan and Nathan, I know Ryan definitely is, they're both TypeScript fans. And so that would be an opportunity to have them come back in and kind of go over all of that. The one reason why we hesitate on that is it's additional syntax. And we find a lot of people struggle with keeping the syntax characters straight. But when we get to the end of JavaScript, we could definitely do that as like a fork opportunity and say, hey, if you're still struggling with JavaScript, you could go over and go in the breakout room with Max, and we can just play around with JavaScript for 2 or 3 days. And then if you feel pretty confident in JavaScript, we could send you over to Ryan, and Ryan could do a 2 or 3 day tutorial on TypeScript. So there's definitely the opportunity there.
Awesome. Yeah, I asked because I know that it's like a benefit for, or it's at least a plus for employers or for recruiters. Like they just like to see that you have that skill.
Yeah, and most because TypeScript is just a variation of JavaScript, it is technically a second language, but because the two are so, you can't execute TypeScript directly, right? So when you write TypeScript, it compiles back to JavaScript, except that compilation basically has all of the checks built into it for the different variable types. So it adds a layer of complication, but then in theory, it's supposed to save you time on catching errors before you actually have an end user who puts in 2 different variable types and you deal with it that way. So yeah, it's definitely something that we can consider either towards the end of this module, or when we just have a couple free days in a module, to circle back on that and have some kind of option on.
Sounds good.
TypeScript is definitely compiled. JavaScript, I want to say is interpreted. I can definitely say it is executed at runtime. So yes, JavaScript is interpreted. JavaScript can also be considered a scripting language. It can also be used as object-oriented, which is another category of programming languages. JavaScript is really weird because it can be used as a procedural language. It can also be used as an object-oriented language. And then I believe it always executes as interpreted, but don't quote me on that. If you look at the Wikipedia page, under like type of language for JavaScript, it will have like 19 things listed out, and it will basically call it a multi-paradigm language, because it is so flexible that it can be used as object-oriented or it can be used as procedural, basically just bigger categories of programming languages and the styles that they execute. If all of those words scare you and you have no idea what they mean, don't invest into that too much right now. That is, I don't want to say is in the weeds, but when you start learning other programming languages after graduation and start comparing them to JavaScript, those categories of programming languages can help understand how they kind of stack up to each other. Excuse me, let me blow my nose and then we can jump into yeah, so the question isn't necessarily around parameter type, it's more around variable type as a whole. And so Joe, you hit the nail on the head, right? Every variable has a certain data type. In JavaScript, because it's a dynamic language, it can change that variable type. But array, integer, JavaScript doesn't actually call them integers, they call them numbers. And then strings, objects, Booleans, true, false. And then the last of the primitive data types, or the most basic data types, would be null and undefined. I feel like there's one that I'm missing off the top of my head. But I wouldn't worry too much because JavaScript is so flexible on data types. We don't need to worry about them too much right now. But what we have seen from them already is like, oh, if I try and add a string to a number, those two are going to get put together instead of actually adding those two things. And so that's when you can get into some weirdness with concatenation and that kind of stuff. But I wouldn't worry too much about diving into that. Okay, let's dive into our code tonight and get some practical hands-on JavaScript experience. So we are going to start with our first function. I'm going to head to VS Code. I'm going to open a new folder. And because we're going to be working on multiple examples tonight, we aren't going to just call it script.js. So I'm going to open up my day 3 folder, and we're going to start playing around with our first function. So I am going to call this temp converter.js. Again, make sure that you don't put the word or the letters JS in front of your file name. Also, make sure that you are not putting a space anywhere in your file name, and make sure that you are case sensitive. So if you do it all in lower, that's fine. But when you get into the terminal, make sure that you are matching that file name. I'm going to go ahead and start a live share. The new step that we don't have a ton of practice on here is right-clicking on this file and saying open in integrated terminal. Don't worry, we'll do a deeper dive on terminal in a second. But what we are going to type in down here is node temp converter. And I'll show you a little trick. Once you type in the word node and a space, if you start typing in the first couple letters, you can hit the tab key. and it will autocomplete and say, let me look at all of the files in this folder. There's only one that has temp in the name of it. So if I hit tab, it will autocomplete that. And when I hit enter, it won't do anything yet. Won't do anything yet because I haven't typed anything in here. But gonna give you a second to catch up. Tempconverter.js is the name of the file. Right click, open in integrated terminal. Then you're going to come over to the terminal here, type out node space and then TE or the first couple letters, hit the tab key to autocomplete and then enter to run it.
Just a quick question. Why didn't we name it program? I mean playground, how we did yesterday?
Because we're going to be working on multiple different JavaScript files tonight. So we want to be more specific. We're going to do a temp converter. We're going to do a bank little application. We're going to work on a couple different ones. And so we want to be more specific on the name of the file so that we can tell them apart.
Yeah, so thank you.
Do we call node to like let the terminal know that we're about to refer to it a lot?
We say node because otherwise, if we just said tempconverter.js, terminal's like, so what? That's a file. Would you like me to edit that file? Would you like me to delete that file? Would you like me to display the contents of that file? What do you want me to do with it? And so we say node, which is everything that we went through on Monday's class to get node installed, because the terminal by default doesn't know how to run JavaScript. It's like, right? Just like by default, it doesn't know how to run Python or Ruby or really any programming language other than Bash, which isn't really a programming language. But anyway, and so what we, by installing Node, we now, when we say the Node command, we say, hey, go use what we installed on Monday. And Node is like, great, I'm here. What would you like? I would like you to go run this code. And so it is going to go into our file and go, well, there's nothing in here, so I'm done running it and we're good to go. Very good question.
Thank you.
Anyone need another minute? Anyone have questions?
Did you say the C was case sensitive or it didn't matter?
It is. So as long as the C is uppercase here, it should be uppercase down in your node script.
Okay.
Spaces are temperamental in the terminal. We'll learn how to deal with them a little further on in the program. But for now, the easiest way is to avoid that. Okay, so for our first temperature converter, we are going to want to provide a bunch of Celsius temperatures and have them converted into the most infuriating unit system in the world. That makes absolutely no sense. And we should all use Celsius. Oh, sorry, rampage there. All right, so we want to build basically this function that says, hey, I'm going to pass you in a Celsius temperature and you are going to return back to me that Fahrenheit temperature. So to do that, we're going to say const, excuse me, and then we need to define what the name of our function is going to be. So we're going to say C to F, Celsius to Fahrenheit. And we're going to say that is equal to, and now we need to tell the function, hey, you're expecting some parameters. Some data is going to get sent into you. Not all functions need to have parameters. It is possible to define a function without parameters, but we need to know what the input Celsius temp is. And then we're going to say, hey, there is going to be a function that runs here. Now, how do we convert question? Anwar, did you have a question? You're on mute if you're trying to talk to us.
Yeah, buddy, you're still on mute. We can't hear you.
All right, I'm going to keep going here until you come off mute. But if you have other questions, let me know. Or throw it in the chat too. Okay, so we are going to say, how do we convert from Celsius to Fahrenheit? Well, the formula is that we take the Celsius temperature and we times it by 9/5, and then we add 32. Okay, we could do that all in one line of code, but we're going to stretch it out here just for that example. So we're going to say, hey, the first result that we are going to do is going to take the Celsius, the input Celsius temp, and it is going to times it by 9 divided by 5. Now that we have 9/5 times the input temperature, we are going to say our final result, and we can call these variables really anything that we want, as long as it doesn't start with a number, as long as we are consistent with that. So we're going to say, hey, the way that we get the final result is taking the result 1 and adding to it 32. And then finally, we are going to console log out the final result.
So to just break it down, so when we get the input of Celsius, it will be transferred into the function right there for input Celsius temp, and then it'll take that, put it into then the constant result. So it'll be multiplied by 9 divided by 5, if I recall. And then after
Yep.
that's done, it now is put into result, and then it will add to, now the result will be added with 32, and that total will then be saved to the final result, and then
Yep.
will be printed out in console
You
log?
got it.
Okay.
So let's try that. I'm going to say I can hit the up arrow. If I've already run that command, up will get me to the last command that I ran. And I'm going to hit enter and nothing happens. Well, we just told it this entire function, but then what Celsius temperatures did we ask it to convert? We didn't. So we need to now ask it, hey, I need to ask you to run. I need to execute that function or call that function. All mean the same thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say C to F. I'm going to make sure that my casing matches up here so it knows what function I'm trying to execute. And then I'm going to put parentheses in, and I'm going to say 20. Now, when I come down and run my node temp converter, it's going to say 68. Okay, we can try that again. We can add in another line that says 100 and 0. Go ahead and run that, and we get 68, 212, and 32. Now, instead of having to do these 3 lines of code over and over and over again, we have grouped them all into this function. So what we are able to do is say, hey, take 20, go send that as an argument into input Celsius temp, take the input Celsius temp and multiply it by 9 divided by 5, store that in result 1, take result 1, add 32 to it, store it in final result, take final result, log that number out, and we get 68. Then it goes, all right, I want to do that again with 100. So it goes C to F. I know how that function is written. Then we go from there. Any questions on functions?
Yeah. So let me double check. So the cons means like something doesn't change, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
So const means declare a new variable that we call immutable. Immutable, just fancy words for unchangeable. So what would happen here is if I said result 1 plus 32, and I tried to store that in result 1, you'll see that when I run it, it says assignment to a constant variable. So it is now mad that I'm trying to store a new result in result 1. So because of that, I could fix that 2 different ways. I could say let result 1, and now my function will run fine this way. Don't follow me on this, just an example, right? As long as I'm consistent and I use result 1 on everything. Or I can fix that by saying, okay, I'm going to store final result in a new variable. So whenever we see const or let, all we're doing is saying make a new variable, and if it's a const, we're not allowed to change that after the initial time we set it. And if it's a let, it is something that can change down the line. And in general, if we can use const, we should, because that will prevent you from accidentally changing a variable down the line that you didn't intend to be changed.
So only use const when you don't want a variable to change, and use let if you do want a variable to change.
Correct.
Okay.
Okay, while we're here, let's get a little bit more practice, because this is not what I would call dry. What's dry stand for? Don't repeat yourself, right? DRY. The problem with this that I have is that I could have 100 temperatures that I want to convert. And if every temperature I had to call C to F, I'd have 100 lines of code, right? And that would kind of be a pain. So I would like to convert a list of temperatures. What data type do we use with a list?
An array.
An array. And what syntax character do we use to define an array? The square brackets or braces. Yep. So I'm going to say const temps equals, and then I'm going to put my opening and closing square braces there. Then I'm going to define a bunch of different temperatures. So I'll say 20, 100, 0, 50, 30, and 10. And that comma is saying, hey, I'm sending in another list item here. Now, I would like each one of these temperatures to get converted in the C to F function. What am I going to do? What keyword am I going to use to get the C to F function to be executed for each one of these temperatures? Very cool.
Maybe it is a for loop.
It will be a for
Yeah.
loop. Think about what I said there. I want something to happen for each item in this list. So that for is saying, okay, for each item, go do something. So I'm going to comment this out. I'm going to highlight all 3 lines and hit Command / just so that we can leave it in there as an example. And then I'm going to say for, and I need to tell it what am I looping over. And so I'm going to say const Celsius temp of temps. Now that I've got that Celsius temp in there, I can say call C to F of each Celsius temp. I'm going to save that, I'm going to run it, and now I get all of the temperatures logging out. It would be the same, Joe, as doing a for let I equals 0 while I is less than temps.length I++. This is just a shortcut. Okay, so let's break down what's happening here. Get out my playbook, which I know some of you love and some of you hate. So I'm going to say, hey, we're making a new thing called C to F. We're going to ignore this entirely until you ask me to do it. Now I'm going to come through and say const temps. Okay, what is that? It is an array. We know it's an array because of these square braces. We're going to comma separate out every item in that array. And what data type are we storing? We're storing numbers for each item in this array. Arrays can store mixed data types. It could store a number and a string and an object. You can nest arrays in other arrays. We'll get more complicated with that as we go. Okay, now I'm using the for keyword. And the for loop is like, well, I need more detail. What do you want me to do? I want you to go to temps, which is going to go back up here, grab this entire array and drop it in right here. And it's going to say, for each one of the temps, go grab the first one and shove it in this thing called Celsius temp. We can call that variable whatever we want, as long as we know that every time that we go on to the next number here, it is going to get sent into the Celsius temp right here. So what we're going to do is we are going to take 20, because temps is part of the array, we're going to drop that in to Celsius temp right here. Now it's going to say C to F of Celsius temp. Well, we just said Celsius temp is 20 here, so we're going to take 20 and we're going to send that into the input Celsius temp here. Now it's going to say 20 times 9/5 is some number. Add 32 to it, console log out the final result. Where does our final result show up? It shows up down in our console as 68. Now, are we done with everything? No, because temps now has another number of 100, it is going to drop 100 into Celsius temp. It is then going to send that into our input. It is going to work through the conversion, console log out the final result, and we see 100 is 212 down here. And one final example for this, we can modify this function, and we can say, let's, instead of console logging it out up here, let's actually return it instead. Now we come down here, we run it, and it doesn't look like anything has happened, but it actually is. We just can't see the output of it. Okay, so how do we see the output of it? Well, we can put a console log in right here. And we not only get our output back, we see all of the numbers. How is that working? Well, when we get 68 as our final result, it's going to return it to whatever called C to F. Well, what's calling C to F? This entire thing. So this entire value becomes 68, and then we console log that out. Accomplishing the exact same thing, well, what's the benefit of that? Well, we could say something like Celsius temp plus a string that says Celsius is this temp in Fahrenheit, and put another plus on there. So now when we run that, we get 20 Celsius is this temp in Fahrenheit, 68. Or we can say 100 Celsius in this temp is 212. That Celsius temp is coming from our loop. Our loop is pulling out each of the temperatures from our array, which is why we call it a for of loop. And then we are able to log out a string that is concatenating a number coming from our loop, coming from our array, with some string, just some text I want to show up everywhere. And by taking the Celsius temp and getting whatever is returned from this function. Just giving access to that variable defined in another function to a related function. Yeah, so think about return as sending back the results of a function to whatever called that function. So we could say something like const converted temp equals C to F of our Celsius temp. And then down here, we could replace that with converted temp. And that is going to do the exact same thing. Okay, I'm going to pause there for 30 seconds, let you guys catch up. And then we're going to practice with our first comments. Is anyone's code not running? Does anyone's code have an error that they would like help debugging? Michael. I'm going to try something new. I'm going to leave my screen share running so other people can reference my code and see if you can also share your screen. Theoretically, this is supposed to work, but I've never actually done it.
All right, so what I'm getting is nans.
Okay, so go ahead and share your screen and let's take a look at the syntax.
I share the right screen.
I don't see it, but maybe I can't see screen shares. Let me stop it. Yeah, now I can see it. Okay, never mind. Did not plan out. Okay, so here's the problem. We are, if you give me remote, we are sending in C to F, the Celsius temp, which is coming from here and actually getting 20, plus the string of Celsius is the temp in Fahrenheit to here. So now it is getting this entire string as input. We don't want it to do that. We want it to say, hey, log out the Celsius temp plus Celsius temp is this temp in Fahrenheit up here. And then add in the Celsius temp. So basically what you were doing is you were sending not only the number 20 in to C
But
to
also the
F,
function.
you were sending this entire string in to the function. And so it got to here and was like, I don't know how to convert a string times 9/5, and it threw that not a number.
Yeah, not
So
a
what
number,
we have
which
to be careful is saying we're only sending in the Celsius temp to that function, and that fixes your problem.
All right, thank you.
Of course. My code back up on the screen. Let me know if anyone needs help or give you another minute to catch up here.
I'm getting an undefined on my thing.
Okay, go ahead and share screen. Yes, Joe, but not really. When we get into the document object model, we'll get more ideas of how we can access that document object model pretty much anywhere in our code. And so because of that, we don't need that as a global variable. But we definitely could declare it as a global variable if we needed to access that data in other parts of our code. So we could do something like declare another array that says let converted temps equal an empty array, and then we could push in all of those conversions into that, and then reference the converted temp array instead of the temp array. Okay. Okay, so we are asking C to V, C to F to store in converted temp. The problem is we can't just use a console log to see that result. Instead, what we need to do is return that data. And so what the return is going to do is instead of console logging out itself, it's going to take whatever value is getting returned here and store it in whatever variable we call here. And so now if we save that and run it, we get all the right temps coming out.
So I had to change the final result to return to get the thing back.
Yep, because we can send data into the function using an argument that lines up with the parameter. But the reverse of that is we need to be able to get the result of that function and do something with it. So initially we were just console logging it. But then we modified it to say, well, we want to console log out something more than just the final result. So instead we asked it to return, which will take whatever is in here and return it into the converted temp. Now that whatever final result is stored in converted temp, we're able to use that down here as well as information like the Celsius temp, which is coming from the input of our for loop.
Oh, okay, okay. Thanks, Max.
Of course.
Can you take a look at mine, Max?
Sure, go for it. So first place that I see a red squiggly is right here. Oh, I'm not drawing. Yep, you got it. It's the red squiggly right there. So what should that be? You got it. So go ahead and save and then run and see what you get. So just click in your terminal and hit up enter. And that will, ooh. Okay, you have
he got
same problem here.
He had to
That
change
console
the
log
console
has to
log.
be changed to a return.
Oh, okay, okay. Return console.
Because if we don't, we actually see the numbers printing out in the terminal, but we don't want them to print out in the terminal. We want it to be returned from that function back to where it was getting called so that we can use that value right here. So right now, C to F isn't returning anything right here. And so when it gets this converted temp, it's like converted temp is undefined. There's nothing stored in converted temp because C to F isn't returning anything right here. So instead, go ahead and change that console log to a return and see if that fixes it. And put a space there and save, and that should probably, yep. And now you get all of your correct temps and you're good to go.
Alrighty, thank you.
Of course. No.
Real quick, just for clarification on syntax, why do we put the Celsius in this temp pairing plus the converted temp outside of the console log?
You're talking about right here, or you're talking about down here. So down here, you're saying, why do we use converted temp instead of what? You're muted.
No, I said, why is it outside of the console log? Like, why don't we console log after that particular portion?
We could, or are you saying do this instead? Or are you saying add another console log further down here?
Yeah, why isn't there another one after that portion? Is what I'm asking.
So what we're doing is we're saying loop through all the items in the array, then do the conversion of that temperature and store it in a new variable, and then log out this, concatenate this, and then log this out. So if we wanted to, we could change this. Don't follow me on this, just as an example. We could say console log Celsius temp, and then console log converted temp. And that, if I can spell console correctly, will give us all of our numbers, right? So it will say the 20 was the first input and the converted number for 20 is 68. The next number is 100, and then after that is 212 as the conversion. So the only reason why we do this all in one console log and we concatenate them together is to basically let us know, hey, this isn't just the input, this is also the output. This is the actual conversion. So it's a little bit easier to not have to go through this and be like, wait, was I converting 0 is 0 Fahrenheit is 0 Celsius? Instead, we get it, hey, this is the input and this is the output. But it just depends on what you want to display basically to the end user. So that's the reason why we do it that way.
Copy, thank you.
And if at any point you go, that wasn't the question I was asking, answer it again, that is totally a fine thing to say to me. Anyone need help? Anyone not have their code running? Everyone good? Cornelius.
I was curious if this is also possible to do in a while loop, if you think it's possible in that way.
It is. I wouldn't. If you feel like you are tapping out and you're like, "Whoa, I'm barely struggling this," just switch off your ears for a second, because this is a slightly more complicated way of doing it. So there are two other ways that we could do this. I'm going to do Joe's way first, just because he asked about it. We can say for let I equal 0, while I is less than the temps dot length, I plus plus, and then we can say const Celsius temp is equal to temps bracket I, and then we can console log out this same thing right here, and this right here. And if we run that, we will see that that loop runs and provides the exact same output as this loop right up here. So that is another way of writing the for loop to basically say start I or our iterator at 0. And while 0 is less than the number of items in the array I++, then we go in I is 0. So 0 goes in and it gets 20 as our first array item, stores 20 in the Celsius temp, does the exact same stuff that it does up here. Then I gets added to, I becomes 1. 1 is index 1 is 100, store 100 in Celsius temp, keep going over the loop that way. This is not preferred because you can see this is just more complicated, right? We have to get the length right. We have to make sure we're not using a less than or equal to. We have to then go in using the index to retrieve the value out. And so we are basically able to save this entire for loop and this line to extract the item out by using the for of loop up here. So that is a easier way to access each item in an array as opposed to running a loop for the number of items in an array and extracting that out. And yes, arrays start at index 0. So when you get the index 1, it's actually the second item in that array. These are different styles or ways to loop. These are not ways that I would recommend to do it, right? This is just for examples to see different ways that you can write a loop. But again, if you're feeling overwhelmed on the for of, that's okay. Switch off your brain. You don't need to worry about these loop types yet. We will come back to them. We will get more practice with that. The other thing I can say if you wanted to do this in a while loop, you can say let I equal 0 while I is less than the array, the temp dot length. Grab the temperature from I, the converted temp, convert it, console log it out, and then finally I++. If you forgot this I++, you would have a infinite loop. So if I come in here and run that, we get the same exact output as we did before. So these are just 3 ways of accomplishing the exact same thing using different kinds of loops. You could also use a do while loop if you wanted to, but just some different options for you. The final kind of loop that we haven't touched on is a recursive loop. We will not touch on that until almost the end of JavaScript because recursion is something the computer can do really well when a function calls its own function, not something that the human brain can understand particularly well. So we save recursion towards the end. I can't be declared within the loop because the scope of the loop resets I every time. So by the time we run this for the first time, when we come outside of the scope of this curly brace, I basically gets reset. So it's the same reason why we are able to change Celsius temp as a constant the second time the loop runs, because after the first time the loop runs, it basically clears out all variables and then we'll reinitialize them for the next iteration of the loop run.
I have a
Does that mean
question.
that you need to? Oop, go ahead.
Your question might be more connected, so you can go ahead.
I just does that mean like if you have multiple while loops, you need to be careful with what you're declaring as the variable name?
Correct. Yeah, scope matters here. So we can't take this and define it in here for two reasons. One, it's going to say while I is less than temps.length, what is I? I don't know what I is starting at. And then the other problem is that when you hit I++ down here, it would increment I, and then it would clear basically all of the variables in here, go to run the loop again, and then say, I don't know what I is, or even be able to store what it incremented to.
Oh, I meant like if you have multiple while loops like within your entire like code base, and like you're gonna need
Yeah,
to
so if
change
you,
like the like I somewhere else, and it's referencing like just not referencing the same
yeah, so if you define something
iterator.
in here, you wouldn't be able to access any variables that you declared in here outside of the while loop. So you wouldn't be able to say new var. That wouldn't work because new var is in the scope of the while loop. And that is true for any time we have curly braces, whether it's a function, whether it's a for loop, whether it's a while loop. When variables are declared inside the function or that block of code, you won't be able to access it outside of it. Safi, do you have a question, or did that answer your question?
Yes, well, you did kind of touch on scope, so I had a question in regards to that. So in regards to learning about global and local scope and how to essentially code so that, respective functions are able to access those variables. I don't know at what point we're going to.
Yeah, so we save that for a lot later on because React breaks everything down into components. And components are easier to kind of wrap your head around scope and the ability of not being able to access state, which is just a special kind of variable in a child component, and having to use the concept of hoisting to take it out of the child component and use it in the parent component so that two different components can access the same data. So we don't dive too much into scope yet, only because it's a harder concept to wrap your head around. And when we get into React, that becomes a little bit more clear.
No, that's fair, but it was just interesting hearing you talk about it in the while. I believe it was the while example, because you mentioned how the function wouldn't necessarily be able to understand or know where the index was because it was within that scope. But it was just interesting hearing you talk about it in that text.
Yeah, the basic TLDR on that. If you're not a Reddit person, TLDR is too long, didn't read. So when people go on like a huge rampage about some topic, and then they get to the end of it, and they're like, "Oh, I realize that not everyone's going to want to read a novel on my post." They put hopefully at the top and not the bottom TLDR, and then like 1 or 2 sentence summary of their entire message. I really love that concept. I think every email, if it is more than 2 paragraphs long, should have a TLDR in it. But the too long didn't read on this is that I can't take the let and place it inside my while loop, because otherwise when I go to run this, it's going to give me an error and it's going to say I is not defined. Well, it doesn't know what I is starting out as right here in my loop, because we didn't define I, we didn't provide a value to I until we got inside that while loop. So you could say, well, wait a second, I declared my let I equal 0 up here. Well, because that is inside the for loop, it gets reset basically as soon as we are done rerunning it. That variable is only defined for the length that this loop is running. And so that's why we need to redefine it. And we call this global scope. What we mean by global scope is it's just outside, it's the highest level of our code. It's not indented. It's not in any curly braces. It is global in that we can access it anywhere after we define that. And we do need to use a let for it because we are adding 1 to it. And if you are seeing the syntax and you're like, what is that doing? That is the equivalent of saying I is now equal to I plus 1. Sorry, give me 1 second. Okay, not to beat a dead horse, but let's go ahead and finish this project up. Because these are all more complicated examples, I really don't want you guys to focus on the variations here. They're good to know. You hear terminology, you see how different code is written. And in HTML, we have already seen there are multiple ways of building a web page with the exact same result. If that annoys you now, wait until you get into JavaScript, because in JavaScript, we just saw 3 ways of accomplishing the exact same thing. Yes, 4 ways, right? Because we also could have come down here and accessed each temperature in the array. So there's not necessarily a right answer or a wrong answer, but in this situation, I would say that this is the better answer, or the one that I would prefer, because it's the least number of lines of code, right? We don't have to write something fancy in here to get the less than working. We don't need to access properties. We're not using the index. We're not keeping track of any of that. We're just going, hey, go over the temp list, and for each item of that list, store it in Celsius temp. So a technique that I like to use to practice on this is commenting out our code. And so there are kind of 2 ways of thinking about commenting out our code. We can either do it in the order that we wrote that code, or sometimes it's more helpful to write our comments in the order that the computer is executing that code. That's what we're going to start for our first time. So don't have to follow along with me here. All of my comments are going to be in GitHub. This is a time that I recommend that you don't actually follow along with me and either put only the numbers in your code or wait until after class and then go through and see if you can write your own comments. Because the best students we have found are the students who go, all right, before tomorrow's class, I'm just going to go through, I'm going to spend 15 minutes and I'm going to add in my own comments, because if I get to a line of code and I can't describe it, that's something I need to ask a question about. So let's dive into that. Again, don't recommend that you follow along with this. Recommend that you understand how I'm describing it. And if you have any questions, now's the time to ask them. So I'm going to say, number 1, create a new variable called C2F that stores a function. Then I'm going to say, skip everything in here because we have not executed the function. We've not provided any input. Come down to the temps and say, number 2, create an array, in other words, a list of temperatures that are all numbers. Number 3, for each number in the temps array, store it in a variable called Celsius temp, then run the code in the curly braces. Number 4, use Celsius temp, the first item in our array, to call or execute the function from number 1. Number 5. Store the argument sent into the parameter of input Celsius temp, which will be the number 20. Number 6, store multiply input Celsius temp, which is again the number 20, by 9/5 and store it in a new const called result1. Add 32 to result1 and store it in a new var called final result. Return final result to where the function was called. Now, number 9, we're going to jump it back down here and say store returned value from number 8 into a new variable called converted temp. Log out the Celsius input temp from the for loop, concat it with a string, and then print out the result of the function from number 9. And then we'll say number 11 on, rerun the loop from number 4 to number 10 to convert all the other numbers in the array. That's the level of understanding we want to get down to, right? We want to say, can we think like the computer? Because if we can think like the computer, we'll be able to debug it. Experience with syntax is going to come down the road. But whenever we finish a project, we want to go, hey, do we understand this, right? Can I explain this code to someone else? Because if I can't, I need Max to explain it to me so that I can go practice that myself. So this is a great exercise if you want to follow along with me, to just put your numbers on every line, and then after class, go back through and see if you can add in your own comments. And if you can't, you can always go to GitHub and see the comments that I put in. And then last resort, that still isn't working, schedule a one-on-one with me or ask me about it in stand-up, because our projects are almost all going to be multi-day projects from here on out. So we don't want you to fall behind at one point and then need help catching up towards the end. So the sooner you ask questions of understanding, the more valuable it will be. With all of that said, does anyone have questions?
No, just leave it on the screen for a bit so I can write the numbers down.
Yep.
Thank you.
And it will all be in GitHub as well at the end of class, so you can get the numbers from there as well. For those who may have prior JavaScript or other programming language experience, how are you feeling about this? No, it might be a little slow, but
I feel bad for derailing class a little bit.
It's
Okay.
definitely bringing back some old memories when I first started out coding. Because especially how numbering, I mean, I mostly commented, but seeing the numbering process is a lot better. So that way it helps put things together. So like if this was an assignment, someone can be like, oh, it's just pretty much going back and forth, and just putting it in an order, like making a sandwich type of thing.
Yeah, functions weren't too bad for me initially when I was doing Visual Basic, I think in my sophomore year, but then I put in the chat the first subject that we did in my AP Computer Science in my senior year was recursion in Java. We were doing like a fractal project, and that it was all downhill from there.
No one should ever start with recursion. Arguably, recursion
was
shouldn't
so
be taught
bad.
until you get into like a 300, 400 level class.
It was so bad. Made me want to cry.
Angel, thanks for weighing in there. This is where it starts getting into like, we're not just naming variables for the sake of naming variables, right? We can actually see something useful here. And if I had anyone I worked with turning code that was this commented out, I'd be like, what is wrong with you, right? But that is because everyone that I'm working with is a junior or senior developer with a couple of years of experience. So I wouldn't recommend that you comment your code out to this level professionally, but it does show you a good idea of if I can't explain that line of code, chances are I won't understand how to use it in future projects.
Another I guess thought I had, I remember when I was learning like loops and functions and all that, and I think the part that tripped me up a lot was understanding the like the syntax and the use of the parameters like within like like initializing like the loop or the function, like trying to like set everything out and explaining that. Like I didn't have that explained to me very well at the time, so I was kind of getting lost at that step a lot. Like what's happening with like const Celsius temp of temps and kind of breaking that down a bit more.
All right. We are going to get our next file set up, and then we'll obviously go on break. We are going to, for attendance, the secret word tonight is Celsius. Glad I didn't make it Fahrenheit, which is much harder to spell. Go ahead and submit attendance for Celsius.
Did we have to do attendance for yesterday if we went to the
No attendance for
okay.
yesterday.
Hi, sorry, I couldn't hear you right. Did you say the attendance was Celsius?
Yeah, the secret word is Celsius.
Awesome, thank you.
Angel, where to start is definitely something that we're going to see more and more of as we work on these projects. And it will become more clear week 7, right? Of, well, we got to build an interface for it. We already know how to do that in HTML. Now we got to go through each user interaction. And because we build so many projects, you'll start to see patterns there, just like you see patterns in your own code.
Yeah, I think that's always where I struggled, was kind of figuring out where to start in terms of like, what do I name my variables? How do I recall these variables later on in the project and kind of create a function? Because I mean, most of my expertise is in Python, so it's a little easier, in my opinion, to kind of define a function and call back to it. But it's always just, where do I start and how do I think about this function to be called back a lot later on down the road? Because you got to think in the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
All right.
yeah, that was my same problem too with Python. And even like now it's just, I think what's troubling me is the like explaining like what's going on inside of the code. Like, hey, like what's the like okay, I got this list here. What is it doing? How is it doing it? And why am I doing it this way? I think that's one of the things that it's kind of, you know, messing me up a bit.
All right, so before we go on break, let's get our new file created. So I'm going to do a new file, and I'm going to call this ageloops.js. And in my age loops, I'm going to do two things before break. I'm going to say const years. I'm going to make it an array. It's an array because it's a list of data, so square braces. And I'm going to put in a bunch of different years. And then to get this to work, all I'm going to do is console log my years out. Now, console log is really smart in terms of knowing what data types it is getting sent in and how it should console log that out or print it out. So console log is smart enough to deal with arrays and objects and strings and numbers. So the important thing here is when we get down into our terminal, we are now using a different node file. So we can't just hit up enter because it's going to rerun our temp converter. So instead, we're going to still type in the word node. We can't forget the space, but now we're going to type in ageloops.js. Or if you do node space A and hit the tab key, it will autocomplete ageloops because it's the only file that starts with the letter A. So if we hit enter on that, we should have our years print out. And if we do, you are good to go on break and be back at 7:25. Again, new file called ageloops. We defined years. We added in a console log for our years. We come down to our terminal. We run the node space, and then we type in ageloops and use tab to autocomplete after you see A. Hit tab, hit enter to run it. You should see the years log out and you are good to go. Yes, it is definitely possible to get user input. Two ways of using JavaScript. You can either use it in the browser, at which point we'll be using input type text fields to pull that input in. We will get into browser-based JavaScript projects week 7, day 1, so after the DevOps module. There are also ways to provide inputs using what we call command line arguments. And command line arguments are basically a way of sending in data from the node command and then being able to access that. That is used less frequently, but normally we'll be interacting with user inputs through HTML and the input field and getting the data from that. Any other questions? All right, break until 7:25. I will leave my screen share up in case you need to catch up. Okay, so I would like to build a little script that goes through the years that people are born and print out whether or not they are of legal age to drink. So the first place that I start with this is, all right, I need all of my data in an array, right? I need a list of all of the years. I have that all set. Now I'm like, all right, what's next? Now I need to loop over all of those years. So in order to do that, I'm going to take out my console log years because I don't need to see that. And I'm going to say for const birth year of years. And again, I can call that anything that I want. This birth year, anything that I want, as long as I'm consistent with it. But the years is referencing the years up here. So I'm going to get 2019 first and 2002, then 1943. And now we run into something that we haven't run into before, at least not in a real world project. And that is the if statement. We want to say, if this thing is true, print out this thing. If it is not true, go print out this other thing. So first, we need to figure out their age. So we're going to say their age is equal to 2024 minus whatever their birth year is. Then we are going to say if their age is greater than or equal to 21, go do something. And just like we have our opening curly braces here, and closing curly braces, think HTML here, right? We can see that in JavaScript, my purple lines up with my purple, my yellow lines up with my yellow. So we are nesting in here. We're saying, hey, because this is indented one level, but really because this is part of this curly brace here, this if statement is going to run for every single birth year that we have in that array. So this curly brace is saying do this thing for every single birth year. This curly brace lines up with this curly brace and is saying what happens if they are 21. So if they are 21, we want to say birth year is allowed to drink because they are age. Okay, so we've got some nesting going on here. We've got the curly braces. We say every time that we get another input from this array, store it in birth year, then calculate their age based off of 2024 minus their birth year. Yes, I'm aware that they can't drink if their birth date hasn't happened at this point in this year, but it gets a little more technical in terms of handling dates. So we focus on just, all right, will they be 21 at some point this year? And then we say if their age, which we just calculated right here, is greater than 21, console log out birth year as a string. So I can put any text in there because it's in quotes. Then I put birth year again, but it's not in quotes. So if I click on this, you can see all the different places that birth year is being used. Birth year is getting loaded up from my of loop. And then I say is allowed to drink because they are age. Age is coming from my calculation up here. I'm going to go ahead and save that. I come down here, I run it, and now I get 2002 is allowed to drink because they are 21. Well, what happened to my 2019? My 2019 is not age greater than 21, and so it just skips that and runs to the next section of the loop and processes that next input. So we want it to print something out for everyone. So we're going to say if the age is 21, console log that out, else, and we got to be really careful where we put that else is going inside the curly brace for the for loop because this else is tied to this if. It's saying if this is not true, go do this thing down here. And so we'll say console.log birth year is not allowed to drink because they are underage at, and then add their age in. Shrink this down. We can keep it all on the screen. I will hit up enter to go rerun this. And now I will get every birth year printing out except 2019 for the first one is not allowed to drink. Now that went a little fast, so I'm going to pause there and give you guys a minute to catch up. if you do have this working, take a minute to go back and go, all right, what is this curly brace saying? What is this parenthesis saying? Where is the matching closing syntax for this? Why do we have parentheses here? We got to tell the for loop how to work. How does the for loop know what it's supposed to do for every item? Because this opening curly brace is matching up with this closing curly brace. What's this age? We know this age is going to get calculated for every item in birth year because it's inside these curly braces. Now we store that in age and we go, if this thing is true, go do everything between these curly braces. And if it's not true, go do everything between these curly braces. And there's nothing preventing us from adding another console log down here. If we wanted to, we could add a console log at the end, which would only print out one time. We're really able to structure things as many levels nested as we would want, just like we are able to with our HTML. Any questions there?
What's actually happening, I guess, behind the scenes with const birth year of these? Is it telling it to like iterate through the array? Does it always have to be an array?
It does have to be an array for a for of. You can literally iterate over an object using a for in loop, but under the hood, it is basically writing the for I equals 0 while I is less than array.length. And then inside of it, it is extracting out the item that we are iterating over. So instead of just giving us access to I and forcing us to go back and access that index again in the array, it's just preloading it into birth year for us.
Gotcha.
All right, hopefully pretty clear. We're starting to see parentheses more. We're starting to see curly braces. We see our square brackets. Important to keep all of those straight and say, hey, square brackets are used for arrays. Curly braces are used for two things. They're used for objects, which we're about to see in 1 minute. And they're also used for blocks of code. A block of code is basically something that is tied to either a function or a for loop or some kind of loop, a while loop. It is basically saying, hey, these lines of code are associated with either this for loop, or they're associated with this if statement, or they're associated with an object, or they're associated with a function. Any questions on this? Hopefully, quick little example, but seeing different data types. Now we've worked with numbers. We've worked with our if statements. We've worked with for loops. Now let's get a little bit more complex on our array data type. We're going to do a little banking app. So I'm going to make a new file, and I'm going to call it banking.js. And we're going to say, let accounts equal a new array. And in that array, I need to keep track of a couple pieces of information, but those pieces of information are all related to each other. I need to keep track of the ID of the bank account. I need to keep track of the type of the banking account. Is it a checking account or savings account? I need to keep track of the balance in that account. Now, of course, we could go into, well, who owns the bank account? When's the last transaction? How do we store all those transaction dates, right? You obviously get a lot more complicated with this. But because I want to store a group of information about the same item, I'm going to use an object for the first time. So I'm going to say, hey, I'm going to make a new object inside the array of accounts with an ID of 1. And then I'm going to put a comma and say the type of that account is going to be a checking account. And the balance of that account is going to be $100. Now I'm going to put a comma at the end of this object because this entire object is the 0 index, the first item in my accounts array. So this comma is not saying, hey, object, you've got more key value pairs coming. This comma is telling the array up here, hey, array, there's another entire object headed your way. And I'm going to paste that and say the ID is 2, the type is savings, and the balance is 50. And just for the sake of getting practice with this, we'll add another savings account with a balance of 350 and another checking account with a balance of 350. Change our IDs so they are unique. And now we've got our first array of objects.
Feels like I'm working in SQL.
We'll get to SQL. Hold your horses. Okay, the bank would like us to add up the balances of each bank account. In order to do that, we now need to go through each item in the accounts list to get access to all of the data about that account so that we can then bury into it, pull out just the balance, and add all of them together. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, let the sum start out as 0. Because if we declare the sum inside of our for loop, it's going to reset every time that we hit a new account. So we need to move this, this variable outside to the global scope so that when we're running over the accounts, we're not resetting the sum for every account. So now we can say for const account of accounts. And this is a naming convention that I like to use. A lot of people will call this const I of accounts, but I really don't like calling it I because it's not representative of what the data is holding, right? So I actually like getting into a singular plural pattern of saying, hey, the thing that we're looping over, the list that has all the individual items in it, has an S at the end of it. But then when we loop over each individual item, we're going to call it the singular of that. So if I come in here and console log out my accounts, I'm going to see, and then in my terminal, I'm going to say node banking.js. So we're in a new file. I'm going to see the array print out 4 times. I'm going to pause there for a second. If it is working, when you go to your terminal and type in node space banking.js, you should have the same information print out 4 times. But we don't want it to print out 4 times. We have just asked it to print out accounts, which has all of the data. We only want to work with the one singular account we happen to be looping over that time. So if we just take out the S here and then rerun our output, we see that we now get access to that object. But objects need a key value pair. So what we are able to do is use the key of balance here to access the value that is in the account of the actual number. So what we are going to do is we're going to take out our console log account because we know that we already have access to the whole object. And we're going to say the sum is equal to the current sum plus the account. And if I just do account and run this, nothing happens. Well, why didn't anything happen? Because I just added this a bunch of times, but I didn't log it out. So I have to say, after my for loop is done, console.log out the entire sum. And what do I get? 0, object, 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 object. I'm like, well, that's not what I wanted. The problem is the entire account, which has the type and the balance information, is just getting concatenated to this sum here. So I want to say, hey, the sum is going to be equal to the sum from the last time the loop has run, plus the account dot balance. Now I am using this key to get this value. So if I save that and rerun it, I get 850. Does anyone not have 850 logging out?
I got an error, but I'm gonna try to debug it first.
Go for it. If you do have this working, try to add an if statement that will only add up the accounts if they are a checking account.
I'm sorry,
I'm
repeat that
sorry, Max.
challenge.
Yeah, I was gonna
Yeah,
ask
but
him. Repeat.
the challenge is to find the sum of the accounts, but only the checking accounts. Basically, find the total balance of all of the checking accounts.
Okay, I couldn't debug it. Can you help me?
All right, share screen.
Let's share my screen. Yeah. So it's giving me like all of the balances.
Yeah. So what we're doing is we're saying, hey, for every account, go do everything between these curly braces. But we don't want it to do it every time. When do we want it to do it?
Once.
Once after it has processed all of the accounts.
Oh, so this should be outside of the 4?
You got it.
Oh, that's not what I want to do, but okay. Still not what I want to do.
So that's a good mistake to make earlier on of realizing, hey, anything inside those curly braces is going to happen every single time we hit a new account.
I understand.
But by moving it out of those curly braces, it will only happen once after we've processed all of the accounts.
Thank you.
Of course. Anyone else need help? All right, let's talk about that challenge. So I said, I still need to run through all of the account types, but I want to only add it to the sum if the checking account type, if the type is set to checking. So what I'm going to do is I said, all right, still needs to happen for every account. So I'm in the list. I need to say if the account.type is equal to, use a double equals or triple equals there. We'll get into the difference down the road. So we'd say if the account type is equal to checking, then I want you to add it to the sum. Else, if it's a savings account, we don't care about it. So we don't even need to add an else statement in there. We can just say if the account.type, just like we can access the account.balance, is checking, then I want you to do this thing. Otherwise, I don't care about it. So we come down here, we rerun it, we get 450, then we can always check our math and go, this plus this are the only two checking accounts, so it will be 450. Now, what's the benefit of all of this, right? Well, I can come in here and go, oh, guess what? A new checking account just got opened, and they've got a balance of $150. And now, without having to modify any of my code down here, by just modifying that array of objects that's holding all of my data, when I rerun this command, I can see my balance increases. So the whole benefit of for loops is instead of having to add everything up manually, we are able to access certain pieces of that information. Now, what happens if I say, all right, I don't remember what the first type of account is that we opened, but I know it is the first account that we opened. Well, I can come down here and say console.log. I know I need to be working in my accounts, so I'm going to add my accounts in there, and I said I want the first account. So that is going to be in index 0. So I go in here and I say 0. I run that, and it gives me my ID1 type checking balance 100. Well, I use the square bracket notation because I'm accessing a particular index inside the array. So remember, arrays, we're always accessing with indexes. We're always accessing with a number, the number of items in the list, right? But I am now dealing with two data types here. I'm not only having my array, but I'm storing all of the data inside that array as an object. So we can chain those properties together and say, well, I'm not just looking for the entire account, I am looking for the type of the account. And so because I'm working with an object, I'm going to say dot type. I'm going to go ahead and save that, come back over here, hit up, enter. Now I get just the word checking coming out. And if I wanted to get the second account type, I could change my 0 to a 1 and get savings out. All right, any questions? Here, the idea to say access second account in array and get its type.
Is there a resource for other like naming conventions? I like the singular plural idea, but
not really. I can't think of any off the top of my head. Mine have just come from like years of experience of working with other developers and then being like, oh, that's a good idea. I should do that. Okay, add some comments in there. How are we feeling? Are we ready for a surprise pop quiz at 7:52 on a Wednesday? Because this a-hole's gonna give you one. So we are going to give you your first JavaScript challenge. I'm gonna send you the link to GitHub right now. Don't worry if you don't get this done in the next 30 minutes. I believe this is your homework assignment for the week. I need to confirm that in Canvas. Yes, it is. And it is due Okay, yeah. I will update that in Canvas. So what you are going to do is you can set up a new file, and you can call this homework.js. You are then going to click on the link in the chat, and it will also be in Canvas in 1 second. And it's going to give you this file that you need to work with. So you're going to go up to this copy. It says copy raw file up here in the top left. You're going to head over to your VS Code and paste that in. And then in order to run this code, you're going to go down to your terminal and say node homework.js. All of the assignments are written here. When you are done with this assignment, you can upload it in Canvas, and it will be due on Friday. However, we're going to give you the rest of class to work on this. Sorry, it will be due on Sunday. I don't know what I'm talking about. Due on Sunday at 11:59.
You want us just to put the answers right under the comment?
Yeah. And some answers may take multiple lines of code. That's all right. And I will say, when you get down to these bottom ones, don't lose sleep over them. So I would say 7 through 10 are going to be really, really challenging. So if you get hung up on those, remember that this is only your first week of JavaScript. We will go over all of these answers the week that I come back after Nathan teaches. So I don't want you to panic. If you can't get 7 through 10, that's okay. We will work on that.
Hey,
And
Max,
yes, Angel,
where do I find it at? I want to
it's
get
in
that.
the Zoom chat, and it's also in Canvas under required project, in-class project, JavaScript practice.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
When I go into Canvas, it said it can't be seen until
Just refresh the page.
Sunday. Oh, okay. Oh, I found it. Thank you.
So moving due dates around a little bit here. This will be the homework that is due this Sunday. And then next Sunday, when you're done with Nathan, your homework will be your capstone wireframes, because when I come back, we have our first capstone check-in. So just want to share the schedule really quickly. This is the last week of computer science, so we obviously have class tomorrow. Nathan comes in the 20th to the 23rd. We are off for Memorial Day, May 27th. A week off from you guys is not enough. I need a week and a day, apparently. So we are off on Monday, the 27th. When we come back on the 28th, we will spend the first half of class reviewing your capstone. That will be you sharing your screen, talking through your wireframes, talking through your project ideas, and kind of sharing that with the class. So homework-wise, the end of this week, on Sunday, the homework assignment we just went that I just assigned is due. Next week, your wireframes will be due for your capstone. And then finally, we will review those wireframes on Tuesday after Memorial Day. Friendly reminder that if you miss class, I come down and hunt you all to make sure that you get to present your capstones to me in a one-on-one. So don't think that you can skip. And trust me, I grow you more on the one-on-ones instead of the group. So probably a good idea to show up for class on Tuesday. All right.
Is there questions
Last-
allowed for this pop quiz?
Absolutely. Yes.
All right. So, do you want us to create any old variable, or does it have to be relevant to the variables that I see already located in this?
Any variable is totally fine.
Okay.
Yeah, I was a little confused when I saw create a variable that's mutable. I'm just like, is that the name of the variable?
Same here.
Any variable, any data type. There are infinite ways to solve this assignment, so just get creative, and I will let you know in the scoring in case you miss any. And again, remember that 7 through 10 are really challenging. Push yourself, give it a try, but don't hold up your submission of the assignment. We will go over those on Tuesday, the 28th.
Is the syntax or multi-line comment the same?
No, single and multi-line syntax is different.
Okay. All right.
So a single line is what I'm using with this //
Yeah.
If you don't know the answer to it, go to MDN or do a Google search for
Okay.
JavaScript comment types. This
Okay.
is an open book test, right?
Okay.
You will
All right.
never hear me say you can't use documentation because there's no job that you would work as a developer that you couldn't use documentation. So if you don't know how to do it, feel free to look it up.
All right. Thank you.
Of course. Good question. To the recording because I forgot the last time. Number 7, just pick a random piece of data that's nested down and then try and access it. So basically say, all right, I want to try and get to the score of 75. So I got to start up at the school and then work with what data type is school. It's an object. So I need to use dot notation. Okay, now I'm trying to get to 75. So I'm going to target the elementary school. Okay, what data type is elementary? It's an object. So I'm going to use dot notation again to get into my teachers. Okay, now that I'm in my teachers, teachers is an array. So I can't use dot notation there. I need to use my bracket notation. So I'm going to use my bracket notation and go, all right, 75 is what I'm trying to get to. It's 0, 1, 2. That's the second index. Okay, now that I've got the second index, how do I access just the score? So if you think about it as peeling back layers of the onion, sometimes you reach a layer of the onion and you go, oh, this is an array. This isn't an object. I need to peel this back a little differently. So for number 7, the challenge is to pick any piece of data that's kind of nested down in here. And once you get down to that level, practice using dot and bracket notation to access data that is nested all the way down there.
I think the number 7 answer is wrong though. The teachers think there should be 1, right? Because you're looking for the second teachers.
Yeah, so ignore this line, take that
Okay.
line out, and just pick some other random piece of data and nest down to that. For that question, I'll accept any piece of nested data, but give yourself a challenge and go, this is what I'm trying to get myself down to. So yes, this answer is technically incorrect. This is a question in the chat. What resources do I recommend to everyone if they wanted better practice with JavaScript and the contents of it outside the scope of this program? I would say reminder that this is only week 1 of JavaScript, right? And these concepts, you've now been exposed to all of them, right? So we don't expect you to be masters of them. There's very few new concepts that we are going to approach here. The rest of this module is just getting more and more practice with the concepts that we've already exposed you to. So this is not meant to be an oh crap moment. This is meant to say, hey, no one learns JavaScript in a week. No one learns computer science in a week. We will get you more exposure to this as the curriculum goes. However, narrow in on what learning style works for you. If you're a free code camp person, you can check out Odin Project. Odin Project has a really good section on JavaScript that will cover all of these concepts. There are plenty of YouTube videos as well. You can just do a search for Intro to JavaScript or Beginner JavaScript and find a bunch of videos that way. Free Code Camp has a great YouTube channel as well. So if you like the style of Free Code Camp, but want video content instead, you can go that way. There is a list of textbooks in Canvas listed under modules that you can take a look at. If you are a textbook person, you can dive into that a little bit. So lots of different resources out there. I personally like Free Code Camp. I like learning in those little chunks, but everyone learns a little differently. So just take that advice with a grain of salt. We're able to complete all of these challenges. Congratulations, you are performing above average this far into the program. If you're still working on them, that's okay. They're not due until Sunday, but I'll be hanging around for at least the next 7 minutes. If you're stuck somewhere, if you really think something should be working and isn't, now's the time to ask those questions. Or if you're looking at that question and you're like, I have no freaking clue where to even start on that, that's also okay. Spoke earlier, the if you go to assignments and scroll down to the optional assignments, if you're sorting by assignment type up here, the week 5 JS module pre-reading, this is the list that has all of the resources in it that I recommend in order that I like them. That doesn't necessarily mean that will be the order that you like them. But again, that was assignments, and then sort by type up here. Scroll down to the optional assignments, and that's all in the week 5 JavaScript module pre-reading. Obviously, do not expect you to use all of these resources or read through all of them, but a list of textbooks are in here and some other videos as well. If you use ChatGPT for this homework assignment, which I'm not saying you can't, but if you do, throw in a prompt of what you asked ChatGPT to give ChatGPT credit. And the reason why we do that is not only so that I can know that you use it and that you're using it for understanding, but think about whenever we quote someone, back in our English essays, we would always include a citation of what we used. And so that can be really helpful for you when you go back into this code and you're like, all right, I know I wrote this code, but I don't really understand how. I don't think I was the one who wrote that. By putting that prompt in there, you can just do a single line comment and say ChatGPT prompt : and paste in what you asked ChatGPT, because that will give you context. Now, if you ever need to re-ask that question, you now know what you asked it to get the answer out. So I'm not saying you can't use it, but if you do use it, please cite it with a comment. Cornelius, go ahead.
So I was trying to really understand the for loop part for question 8. I did
Okay.
2 iterations of it. And I got
Go ahead.
in my terminal